Welcome to the first episode of Wiser Dialogue, conversations with women of color about issues, policies, and research that impact our lives. On this episode, we have two guests, Julianne Malveaux and Margaret Simms. Julianne is an economist and socio-political commentator. Margaret is also an economist and non-resident fellow at the Urban Institute. In 1986, Margaret and Julianne edited Slipping Through the Cracks, The Status of Black Women. Now, this is probably the first edited volume to look at Black women in totality. It looks at education, family structure, labor market. It even looks at Black women from an international perspective. So I wondered, what was the motivation behind the book?
We were excluded. We were really excluded. And Phyllis Wallace was my mentor, and you were kind of my mentor. You were an older sister, not that much older, but a sister in economics who had encouraged me. And we were looking at what happened at the meetings, and we were never there. The issues of Black women, I mean, if you look at, the 80s, when people talked about women, they didn't talk about Black folks. When they talked about Black people, they didn't talk about women. Phyllis Wallace, with her book, Black Women in the Labor Force, really was the first one to put that out there. But even after that, there just wasn't that much. And so I think we kind of collaborated and said, let's do this. I don't know, did we have funding? I don't remember.
Yeah,
a long time
we
ago.
eventually got funding from the Ford Foundation to do it.
But
But I think, also, too, we profiled a lot of Black women and their work, which was another piece of it. And that is, it isn't just that the discussion of Black women wasn't at the meetings. Black women were not seen at the meetings.
Precisely.
So
and so that was one of the really important things too, is the sisters that we were able to lift up in terms of getting a publication. Mm-hmm. Because in the academy, of course, getting a publication is so important. And we did it correctly. I'm just thinking back, we had everybody's paper was reviewed. So it wasn't just that we took everybody's paper. We had a couple disgruntled people whose papers we didn't take, if you recall.
Yes, I do recall.
There was one particular human being that just kind of bugged the you-know-what out of us. So how come you won't take my paper? Because they ain't good. But, there was a rigorous review process, and we were determined to replicate the standards of the profession, but expand the reach of the profession.
Exactly. And unfortunately, there's still a lot of room for that expansion today.
I remember, I don't know if you remember this, and I'm just remembering it, that we didn't have as much as I thought we should have about international. Mm-hmm. And so at the last minute, I decided I was going to write a piece and put it in about women in South Africa. And this was just when we're looking at Mandela and, the resistance. And at the time I was working on the Free South Africa movement in San Francisco. I was in San Francisco, then you were in Washington.
I was in Washington.
And we were back and forth. And I remember looking at the volume and saying, we have to have more international. And so just like literally exhaling a piece to just make sure we had kind of included that part of it. So we were really working, both of us, outside the box in terms of putting Black women's footprint on the economics profession.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that struck me about the conversation between Margaret and Julianne about the motivation was about the edited volume is how much hasn't changed. Black women still don't have a strong presence at the economic conference. If you look at research around Black women's social economic status, it's still pretty scant. So at the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race, our mission is to expand women's focused research. So I asked Julianne and Margaret, what did they see as the most pressing policy and research issues facing women of color, and in particular, Black women?
People forget that the case that put sexual harassment into the law was the Meritor versus Vinson case. I may have it backed up. But Michelle Vinson was a Black woman who was working for a bank here in D.C., Meritor. Her boss, unfortunately a Black man, extracted sex from her over a period of time, more than several dozen instances. And he always used, I'll take your job away from you, as his, leverage for her. He finally fired her anyway, and she sued, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And that's how sexual harassment got into Title 9 or 7. Anyway, that's how sexual harassment got into the law. The reason that that's important is because people fail to acknowledge the significant impact that the workplace treatment of African American women is significant, not only in Me Too, but in all of this. So when Oprah Winfrey at the Oscars talked about Reese Taylor, who was a black woman, 23 years old, walking home from church with an elder and her child, and 2 white men, or 4, with a bunch of them, decided that she was sexually available, and raped her, and they never paid any consequence for it. I think that the treatment of black women, especially, I don't use the term women of color in all of this because it really originates in the way that black women were treated. And you understand that you don't get black folks who look like me and Margaret because white folks behaved. You basically get light-skinned black people because white men were greedy. And they decided in a racist, sexist, predatory, capitalist society that you could thingify, in the words of Dr. King, women. And you could especially thingify black women. White women were complicit. They watched their men thingify us and conspired with them to steal and sell our children away. And so when we talk about the research, although we want to talk about the contemporary period, it's important for me to have us look also at the history and why Me Too is an inadequate response to sexual harassment when sexual predatory behavior is written into the very nature of our Constitution. One of the things that I did with Dr. Wallace was look at work on private household workers. In 1940, 70% of us were maids. In my personal history, my great-grandmother was a private household worker, and my mom actually, while she was a student at Xavier, also worked as a maid to a white family. And all these issues we're not talking about, the fight for 15, wage theft, these are things that black women experienced, and we don't want to talk about it. So I think that there's a whole piece of workplace history that needs to be talked about, as well as the contemporary stuff. But I'll just start there. I know Margaret probably has more, but it's, I find some of the invisibility of black women at some level extremely infuriating. And I find the extent to which white women want to step up and act like they invented this stuff to be distasteful. And not only distasteful, but ignorant.
Well, I want to add, when Julie talked about the fact that when we talk about race, we talk about black men. When we talk about gender issues, we're really talking about white women. And within the economics profession, that basically you're reduced to a coefficient, and a coefficient in one equation. So the idea is that if you can put in a variable for race and a variable for gender, that you've explained black women's experiences. And that's just not true. And you can't assume that a number tells you about the experience that women have had and are still having. And that if you could just change the coefficient, everything would go away. Because that's not really what's driving it. And you'll find researchers who will look at the number and say, oh, well, this confirms, or this, I don't understand this one because it doesn't conform. And it doesn't conform because they have no context for what they're looking at.
So they don't know history. I love the way you say that about reducing it to a coefficient, because that really puts it in economic language and makes it really clear about how measurement is so inadequate. And you just throw in a coefficient without throwing in anything else. And so I think, with all of the work that's been done, we can go back to Becker and the economics of race and never really dealing with gender. And Barbara Bergman, who we all, of course, saw as such a trailblazer on women's stuff, but never really dealing with race. Mm-hmm. As brilliant as she was, it was something that just seemed to not...
Well, and I think to sort of extend that, and Barbara's not unique here, to think that they can take their experience as women and see our experiences in their experience without knowing that those really are not the same experiences.
Let's just see the world through their racial lens, without looking at even. I mean, I remember years ago, Margaret. It's one of the C-SWEP meetings, and white women talking about housework, and talking about how basically their whole thing about housework and how it was oppressive. And I'm sitting there thinking, and the black women did all the work. Y'all didn't do the work. Y'all really didn't do the work. So why are you having this conversation with me about housework? And I remember this woman getting in my face. I'm trying to remember her name anyway. She was one of the progressive women economists who talked about men who didn't pay their child support. In the context of housework, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, have you ever thought about the economic experiences of these men? I mean, some of them don't pay their child support because they trifling, mostly white men. Some of them don't pay their child support because they don't have jobs. And it's a totally different thing. And it was an amazing meeting to me, because afterwards people were coming up to me saying, oh, I never thought of it that way. Oh, I never thought of it. Well, so why can you write this stuff with authority without thinking of it that way? Mm-hmm. Without even saying a paragraph, which I think Heidi Hartman has been better at than most. Not great at, but we call them names, what the heck. But, even a paragraph saying this is not coming from these women's experience. Mm-hmm. So I think that at least she's begun in her work to lift that up, that maybe we don't know everything. Mm-hmm.
And of course, we shouldn't neglect to point out that black men often don't quite get the picture either, because they're looking through the racial lens, and if they look at gender at all, it's often to think that black women have it better than they do.
And that's such a myth, and so corrosive. And it does, if you look at a pie, and you look at the way the pie is sliced, we may have a little bit more than white women do vis-a-vis their men, but we don't have everything. And you look at people with a PhD, the most recent data from a couple years ago, and this average white man PhD earns about $1,600 a week. Average black woman, $1,000. Mm-hmm. In the middle, white women, black men, about $1,200-$1,300. Always divided by a few dollars. Now, I'm not sure how black male researchers look at that data and decide that black women are better off, but they can parse it in ways that say, if you compare black men and black women to white men and white women, maybe we're better off percentage-wise than the white women, but we're still at the bottom.
Yep.
And so, and too many of our brothers don't really get that, or if they get it, they don't want to deal with it.
That's true.
Or more.
And I think so, it may be a little unfair, but I think in some contexts, the idea is that if they expend too much energy focused on black women, it's at their detriment. I think that's a problem that we all have, is seeing it as a zero-sum game, that if one group gains, the other group loses, even within the black population. And that's something we kind of have to get away from.
Well, really, what it feeds into is the invisibility of black women. I'll never forget again, of course, drawing on my history in publishing, I think this was in the early 80s when Black Enterprise had a cover with a black man and a white woman arm locked like a arm wrestle thing, and talk about who gets the benefits of affirmative action. And my response was, where's a black woman laying on the ground?
Well, I think she's not in the running. It was implicit.
Exactly, and there's just been too much of that. There's been too much of that. I mean, the status of black women, we can go through and look at. And the fact is that we're the backbone, but we're the backbone of our community, but we're not recognized and we're not researched. And it's not so much recognition as researched. And so we are a legitimate course of study and yet when we study us, it's diminished, just like you're doing self-study. But really, it's really important. And our study, in my mind, often does come from our experiences. Just looking at the ways that we've experienced life, or like I said, I started doing work on private household workers based on the experiences of my grandmother and my great-grandmother. And just that made me curious about how this work was paid, how it was not paid, how we managed it, what the data were, and it was interesting. Probably I should have done a little more on it, but interesting course of study. But the fact is that most people's research is motivated from their experiences, but not many have had our experiences.
That's correct. And I think one of the things that's hopeful now is this movement toward community engaged research, where you don't just study a community, you engage the community in informing what you're going to study and helping you interpret the results. And I think that is something that will help us move toward a better understanding of the conditions under which people are living and what solutions are likely to be effective.
There are a couple of things that stand out in my mind from the conversation about pressing policy issues. The first being how Black women's experience in the workforce, whether it's as a domestic worker, as it relates to the Me Too movement, the ways in which we conduct research is often motivated by our own experiences. Now, that's not to suggest that that's not the same for all women, but I think it is particular, in some ways particular to Black women, and it also explains the ways in which when others are thinking about the research around Black women, not having that personal experience makes it difficult for them to understand the outcome, which goes back to what Margaret said. You get the coefficient, or you try to reduce us to the coefficient, and then when the coefficient, whether it is the gender coefficient, the race coefficient, or the interaction of the race and the gender coefficient doesn't confirm whatever theories you have, somehow the natural response is that there may be something wrong with Black women, when what's really is missing is that the researcher doesn't understand the experiences of Black women, and therefore it is difficult for them to understand the result that they've gotten. I'd like to thank my guests, Julianne Malveaux and Margaret Simms. Thank you for watching Wiser Dialogue, The Missing Viewpoint.